In this week's lesson, we'll be painting cut stones. First step is to draw this on watercolor paper. There's a line drawing for your reference in Blackboard. We will go from this to this. The colors we'll be using for this project are lamp black, mauve, burnt umber, burnt sienna, yellow ochre, yellow mid, and white. I'll begin by mixing the first three colors. We'll use burnt umber, some burnt sienna, and some yellow ochre. I'll also mix a gray color by using lamp black and some white. I'll mix all three colors with some water, making sure I clean my brush in between, and then I'll add that gray color to each one of the colors just to gray it all down. Next, I'll dip my brush in some water and wet the entire surface. Now I'll take all three colors and paint in some texture in a diagonal pattern. I'll use a little bit of water to blend in between the colors, but I don't want to overblend so that it's muddy. Now I'm going to add some saran wrap and just place it on the painting and press it down firmly. Then I'll wait for this to dry. Once the painting has dried, peel up the saran wrap. This will give the painting a little more texture. Now I'll go back in with the original three colors and apply more texture and soften it on a dried surface. You can see that I'm maintaining a diagonal pattern to the texture. Now I'll go in with a toothbrush, take each color, and flick paint onto the surface. Now I'll mix the mortar color. I'll use some burnt sienna, some black, and some burnt umber. I'll mix these colors together really well and I'll add a little bit of water. Now I'll go in and paint the lines in between all of the stones. Try your best to maintain a consistent line thickness. However, you can go back in and fix the areas with a brush and some paper towels. Now, using the same mortar color, I'll paint all the way around. Here I'm using some clean water, and I'm cleaning up some of my lines that were too thick. Now let's mix the highlight. I'll start with some yellow ochre, some white. I'll mix that up, and then I'll add some yellow mid. I'll add a little more white just to brighten it up a bit. And a bit of water just to thin it down. Using a scrap piece of watercolor paper, I'll just test the consistency. Then I'll add my highlight color to the inner rectangle of each cut stone. Once again, try to be very consistent with the width of your lines. The light source here will be coming from the top right. Now I'll move on and paint the highlight on the top part of the inner rectangle. Sometimes it's easier to flip the painting to get a better angle. Now let's mix the low light. I'll be using mauve, burnt umber, and some black. Again, I'll use that scrap piece of watercolor paper just to try out the consistency. With the light source in mind from the top right, I'll paint in the low light on the left-hand side and on the bottom. Think of these inner rectangles as protruding panels. Now I'll mix the shadow wash. To do this, we'll use the low light color and we'll add a lot of water. This will create a wash. The idea is that it should be translucent when it's applied. We want the edges of these stones to appear beveled. To do this, we'll add the translucent wash to the low light side with the light source in mind. To reinforce that beveled shape, we'll paint in 45-degree angles at the corner. It's important that the shadow wash isn't too dark. You want to be able to see the texture through it. Now I'll add a shadow wash to the left side, away from the light source, and I'll still maintain that 45-degree angle on each corner. Now I'll go back, use the shadow wash, and reinforce some of the corners on the bottom. This will help separate it from the left side. Alright, let's mix the tint wash. We'll use some white and the mixed highlight color. I'll also add a fair amount of water. I also want this to be a translucent wash. Use that scrap piece of watercolor paper to test out the consistency before committing. Now I'll go in and paint the translucent wash on the right hand side of the beveled edge facing towards the light source. It's important not to get any of that tint wash onto the mortar. It's also important to maintain that chiseled edge, that 45-degree angle at the corners. Now I'll paint that tint wash on the top. Now I'll go back in and reinforce the corner. I want the top to be slightly brighter than the right side. Now I'm just going back in and reinforcing some of the shape just to give it more dimension. Now I'll take that toothbrush, dip it in the shadow wash, and flick paint onto the surface. This will give the painting more texture, especially in the highlight colors and the tint wash area. This step is optional, but I like to use some colored pencils and add some veining lines into each of the stones, just to give it visual interest. I'm also using black and white, just to define the area a little bit more and give it more dimension. And that's it. You're done.